Well, I've been telling you for 11 weeks that we're going to talk about some of the things we need to talk about Job when we got through with the text. So now I have put it off as long as I can. We finished it up last week as far as the text. So we're going to see what we can accomplish tonight. And I can guarantee all your questions will not be answered because all our questions cannot be answered. But we'll try to cover a few good things that will be helpful, I hope, in our time. Before we do, we're going to have a prayer. Brother John Ferguson is going to lead us in that. Will you please bow with us?
Eternal God in heaven, we're so grateful that you have allowed us to be here this night to open our hearts to receive your words, those engrafted words that are able to save our souls. We're so grateful for Brother Steve and his preparation and presentation of your will tonight, that our hearts will be open, words of wisdom that will guide us from day to day. We ask, dear God, you bless him in his studies and bless all the teachers who serve in their capacity. It's in the name of Jesus we thank you. Amen.
One of the things that I hinted about last week that I think we need to talk about as we go through Job, you remember we talked about Behemoth and Leviathan when we came across those passages as God talks to Job in his second speech. Well, we want to talk tonight a little bit about scientific foreknowledge. This is a tremendous thing as far as those of us who have faith in God's word and want to communicate that to other people. It is also something about which we need to be careful. And as I read about this over the past few weeks, kind of getting ready, I found even more warnings than I knew existed about scientific foreknowledge. The thing being, we do not want to turn to a passage and say, see, here's where somebody in the Old Testament days knew something that even scientists don't know today. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that when we read, particularly in the book of Job, we're reading language that is mostly poetic. Now, not all of it. At the first and the end, there are specific accounts of what happened. But in between, there is language that much of it is figurative. And so we have to be careful about taking the word out of one of those verses and making it literal when it really wasn't intended that way. You know, we hold other people accountable for that. When we come to figurative language, we see something about 1,000 years of rain, and we say, now that's figurative. That's not literal. That represents a long period of time. Well, we have to be careful that as we approach unbelievers, or those perhaps who are searching, we don't make a case for something that's not really there. Because when we do, we lose our credibility. Secondly, some of these Hebrew words can have more than one meaning or application, and there's an argument about which one is best in a particular verse. So I'm simply saying all of this to say, let's be careful with this. It seems to me that probably we would not be able to take the scientific foreknowledge in the book of Job and take someone who's an atheist, present it to them, and they suddenly say, oh, now I believe the Bible. It's just not going to be that powerful anyway. But let us be careful with it. And what we're going to do is look at some of the things that are often cited. And these are scriptures that I've heard all of my life presented as scientific foreknowledge. The more I've read about these, the more I am convinced that they may be, but we're probably not going to convict any unbeliever by these passages because there are so many responses to it that suggest, for instance, figurative language, or it doesn't really mean that, or has another application. Job 26 in verse 7 talks about the placement of the earth in space. It says something to the effect that the earth, which hangs over nothing or hangs on nothing. And of course, there are at least some cultures in the past that had a representation of the earth as being the center of everything, and certainly not hanging out in the middle of a solar system by itself, hanging on nothing, but maybe on pillars or on the back of an elephant or whatever it might have been in various legends and cultures. But this may or may not be exactly something that Job was expressing that shows an understanding different than what all the cultures would have had back then. There's some questions about that. So it might not be especially dramatic proof to someone as far as believing the Bible. Another one is a few verses later, chapter 10, or verse 10 of that same chapter, and it speaks of the circular horizon. At least that's the New King James translation. And, excuse me, the idea of the sphere of the earth, which of course some cultures and sometimes did not have a concept of, and not everybody agrees when that actually became a commonly held understanding among mankind. So this may well represent scientific foreknowledge, but it's difficult to prove it enough to cause someone to believe because of that. Job chapter 36, verses 27 and 28, we read about things like the drawing up of water and about the clouds that give the rain. And what we have there is what's sometimes called the hydrologic cycle. Probably somewhere in your science class in school, you heard about this, where the rain falls and then it goes down through all the little tributaries or whatever, makes its way to a stream, goes into the ocean, and some of it evaporates, goes and used by the trees, and they transpire and they have evaporation and so forth. It goes back up, and then it's up in the sky, and then it goes back to rain again. It's just a cycle. That's what happens with water in our world in kind of a general sense. And some people see that in these two verses right here. Again, may well be, but there are those who find problems with that. So we want to be careful about presenting that as absolutely for sure as far as scientific foreknowledge. Job 38 and verse 16 speaks of springs on the ocean floor. Now, obviously, if that were specific, if that were real, literal, then we would say, well, how would Job possibly know? Because they didn't have a lot of things to go down to the ocean floor back then. That just wasn't done. And many generations, many centuries later. So that could well be an indication of something that there is water, places where water comes like that, at the bottom of the ocean. But there are people who would challenge that as well. And then later in that chapter verses 25 and 26, there seems to be some relationship between lightning and rain, which of course, lightning does have some relationship with rain. You can have rain without lightning, but there is a climatic relationship between those two things sometimes. And some people say, well, look at there, Job knew things, or wrote things at least, or said in the book of Job, that certainly were not known as far as the meteorological folks, which didn't exist in that day and wouldn't for centuries later. So I present all of these things not to say don't ever bring them up, or not to say use them indiscriminately, but to use them carefully. Probably read about them yourself in 2 or 3 sources if you're going to say, oh, the Bible speaks of things that scientists just discovered in the last few hundred years. Well, probably so. Well, there's some other examples we'll talk about in a minute, that for sure. And these may be too, but be aware that these are subject to a great deal of opposition because of word meanings and the literal versus figurative. What was God really saying to Job in these? So use them for the value that they have and not too much. Now, while we're talking about this, I thought it would be an appropriate time to also talk about urban legends involving the credibility of the Bible, not just scientific foreknowledge, but just in general. Have you ever been told that women have one more rib than men? Now, where did that come from? Well, obviously, God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam. He took a rib from his side, and he fashioned woman out of that rib, and he brought her and presented her to Adam. So obviously, Adam has one less rib. So men have one less rib than women. Okay? You don't want to ever say that to anybody in defense of the Bible, because anatomically that's not true. And of course, we wouldn't expect it to be. Today, if someone were to have an injury to their body and lose some part of their body, they wouldn't expect that all their offspring from there forward would simply have that same loss of whatever it was. And of course, that's not true. We need to be sure that when we defend the Bible, when we present evidence that's valid, we do it carefully. Another thing, how many have heard of Joshua's lost day? This is in the area of scientific foreknowledge in a sense. Nobody ever heard of that? Okay, got a few. I thought surely you had. It's been around since I was a kid. I know at least that long. Well, it's been around longer than that because they traced it back to somebody in the early 1900s, I think, when the idea first got started, long before NASA got involved in it. But it goes something like this. NASA was going to send some kind of orbiter up or some kind of ship to a faraway place. They had to know, exactly. They had to know down to the split second how to plan those things. They had to go back in time and just plan everything so that the timing was exact, so that the orbiter got where it was supposed to be at the right time. Well, as the story goes, they did that. They found that there was a day missing in time. And they got to studying, and finally one of the scientists said, well, I think I remember something in the Bible about that. And of course, one of the battles, the Lord stopped the sun for a full day while the Israelites won a battle, with Joshua at the helm. And they said, okay. They did all the calculations, but they came up 40 minutes short. It was 23 minutes and 20 seconds. Well, the guy said, I think I remember another place where the sun went backwards on the sundial. And looked it up, found out old Hezekiah, Isaiah said, you're going to die. Be ready, make your preparation. He turned his face to the wall and prayed to God. Before Isaiah got out of the palace, he came back, and God says, you're going to live some more. He wanted a sign. And we can make the sun go forward. No, anybody make the sun go forward. I want to see the sun go backwards. And so the sun went backwards, and that accounted for the 40 minutes that the scientists at NASA were looking for. Isn't that a beautiful story? Trouble is, there's not a bit of fact to it, except those things did happen in the Bible. There's no truth to that story. In the first place, it can't be true. There's not some atomic clock that's been on Earth since the day of creation that can account for every minute of every hour of every day. It doesn't exist. The whole story is just fiction. But that story's been around a long time. It's been passed around back before there was internet. It was passed around at the copy machine at the water cooler. And then later on the internet, it's been passed around that way. Now, what do we do if we use a story like that to some of our friends that maybe don't believe, or they're not sure whether they believe the Bible or not? We lose their credibility. That's why we want to be careful. Same thing that we said about urban legends. What about Darwin's deathbed confession? Anybody ever heard of that? Darwin, on his deathbed, he was ready to go. He confessed his belief in God. Well, odds are he didn't, but there's certainly no evidence that he did. And the people that were there, all the historical documents that we have, nobody said anything like that. So that's one of those stories that you say, well, listen, even the rankest of unbelievers at the end, they turn into believers. Don't you know what happened to Darwin when he was about to die? He confessed his faith in God. No, there's just no evidence to hold that up. That's one of those long, way back historical urban legends. And there's many more. And again, I present these so that whenever we see something, and today they come around on the internet regularly, don't they? We want to check them out before we pass them on. We want to see, is there anything to this? I mean, if it's a story about something good that a Christian did, if something's bad about something an unbeliever did, if it's something about, they found the front end of the ark on a mountain in Turkey, whatever it is, to maintain our credibility as God's people, so that people will listen to us when we do preach to them the truth. That's not my Bible. My Bibles in here. When we do preach to them the truth, they don't see it as an urban legend, a fairy tale, a fallacy, a legend, or something like that. Okay, that's why we want to be sure of these things. So whether it's casual conversation or what we say to our young people around the water cooler at work or pass along on the internet, we want to be sure that what we're passing along is factual. It has a real basis behind it, because if not, it's going to make us make it that much more difficult for us to share the truth of God's message with people. Any comments? Yes, I had an article, I think, in the bulletin maybe last year, maybe it was down here that Steve Higginbotham wrote, and it was all these fallacies about the birth of Christ, and that was one of them. You know, the wise men were not there the night Jesus was born. It just didn't happen. That was not the time frame. We'll not go into that in detail. But the point is, if you want to share the truth, be sure it's the truth first. You know, sometimes it requires us doing our homework. Okay, moving forward. Oh, got some more to go along with this. Have you heard about Matthew Fontaine Maury? He was a guy back in the 1800s, and his story is true. We just want to be sure we don't overplay the story, because sometimes I've read the story and it's been embellished a little bit. He read from Psalms 8 and verse 8. Let's read the whole thing. You have made, this is David praising God, you have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. Well, Matthew Maury latched on to that verse. And he said, the Bible says there's paths in the sea. That fascinates me, because you see, he was a sailor. Now, he became a landlubber because of an injury. He couldn't go to sea too much anymore as a sailor. But he spent several years on ships, and he had heard people talk about that it wasn't unknown that there were currents and there were winds and there were ways to travel and there were ways not to travel on the oceans of the world. But nobody had put it all together yet. It wasn't like Matthew Maury invented all this. You know, the first time he came up with it because he read Psalm 8:8. But he did say, you know, I just believe if that says that in God's book, it must be true. So he became known as the pathfinder of the seas. He started charting all these things. He made friends all over the world. There were restrictions on what some ships could do if they didn't send their charts, their findings to Matthew Maury so he could enlarge his works. And he shared them with sailors in a number of different countries. He became a celebrity and close to a lot of celebrities. He's buried in Richmond, Virginia, between two presidents of the United States. So he was a pretty well-known dude for his time. He's called the Pathfinder of the Seas because he charted the currents and the winds that God had put in his creation on the earth, the paths of the seas, because they are there. And, you know, that's, how did David know something like that? Well, he was way before Matthew Maury's time, and way before anybody would have been charting the currents and the winds to see which was the best way to get across somewhere, making a map out of it. So, good example there. Just don't overblow the story, because some people tell the story almost as if it were miraculous or something. It wasn't. It was a man whose psalm stuck with him as he grew older and caused him to look for something. Okay. Finally, if you want some really, really good scientific foreknowledge things here, it doesn't get any better than the things in Leviticus chapter 17. If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. The Lord made a promise to his people, the Israelites, to prevent what that might literally, as far as there's part of their sacrifice, substance that when mixed with water was a whole lot like soap to cleanse things with, to keep them from eating some of the creatures that for a traveling people, which they were, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years especially, would not be very healthy for them, like hogs. And just over and over in the book of Leviticus, circumcision on the 8th day, the day that the vitamin K and whatever's associated within in the body that prevents blood clotting is the highest that it will ever be in that young male child on the 8th day. It's higher than it'll ever be before or after in his life. And that was the day that he said, Moses, you serve. It's circumcised your male on the in the book of Scientific. I mean, this guy before this book by S.I. McMillan, None of These Diseases, a little book. It talks about lots of other things too, but it talks about these examples. You have a chance to get a copy of it. I like the original better than the update. There's an update that's been added by a grandson. He's been gone for quite a few years. I like the original. I've got a copy of it. And I don't think his grandson's writing really added a lot to it. He's tried to update it a little bit, but I don't think he's added anything to the book. But it's called None of These Diseases by S.I. McMillan, if you should want to read it. Okay, now let's get to theodicy. We introduced this back on the first time that we talked about Job, the first night. The question is suggested by the three sides of this triangle. This was first thought up as far as we can tell. Now, obviously, when you go far enough back in history, somebody may have said it before the one that history tells us about. You never know. But as far as we know, this particular arrangement of these three facts right here and the supposed conflict that they caused was by a fellow, the 4th century BC, by the name of Epicurus. And this is called the Epicurean paradox because it's supposedly unexplainable by those who believe in God as the God that we know the Bible presents him. So Epicurus, and if you think that sounds a lot like Epicurean, that's the same dude. He believed that the secret to happy life was seeking for pleasure with some restraint. He wasn't a hedonist, but seeking a pleasurable life, quiet, family and friends, and finding the best things in life there were to enjoy in moderation. Sometimes we think of him as a pure hedonist. He just, give yourself into everything. He wasn't that, but he did say pleasure is all there is in life. And after this, you're gone. He said, probably can't quote it. There was a Latin phrase, but he said, I was not here. I was here. Now I'm not here, and I don't care as far as his life. He didn't exist. He was born, he died. After death, nothing. That's what he believed and taught. So life, pleasure, that's what he sought. Pleasure in this life. Didn't believe in God. And he says, here's why. Can't be a God like this. Because you can't have a God that is all powerful and a God that is all benevolent or all good, and then look around the world and see that evil exists. If he were all powerful, he would stop. If he were all good, he would stop. So it's got to be one or the other. Since evil exists, one of those other two sides has to be untrue. That's the paradox, the Epicurean paradox. And if you talk to many, many unbelievers today, I'm talking about people who make it a point of expressing their unbelief, they will probably throw this at you and say, I know God doesn't exist, at least not the God you're describing, because of, these reasons right here. He may not know it's the Epicurean paradox, but he'll know these three things. You say, if God was all good and all powerful, he wouldn't let things go on the way they are in the world today. And of course, he could have said that, a century ago or 2 centuries ago or any other time and use it as an argument. So here's the thing. How do people respond to that? Well, over the years, some people have responded by saying, well, God really isn't all-powerful. There was a man by the name of Harold Kushner. He was a Jewish rabbi. He wrote a book back in 1981, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Some of you probably got a copy of this on the shelf. It was a pretty big seller back then. Harold Kushner had a son, only son, born to him, 1963. He died at the age 1977, the age of 14, of progeria. The disease which causes advanced aging. A person literally becomes an old person and dies by the time they're a teenager. And he had to find some way to deal with that because of the God he believed in. And so he wrote this book because he came to the conclusion, no, God really isn't all powerful. He's limited in some ways. He wants to do good, but there's some things he just isn't powerful enough to do. So some people say that the way to solve this is God really isn't all powerful. He's all good. There are others who say that, God's all powerful. He created everything, and he set everything in motion. He wound everything up with a big divine key, and then he backed off just to watch. He's not really good. And that's what we call deism today, among other philosophies include that. God started it all, but he really isn't involved in what's going on, doesn't care. He's powerful. Maybe he could do some things, but he hasn't. He's backed off to just let man make his own messes, clean up his own messes, and do whatever. So some people say, well, God is not all good then. Either way, of course, it impugns the character of our God. And then thirdly, there's some people who deny the existence of evil, aren't there? Religious people. Who would that be? Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy. Evil, just an illusion. It's all spiritual. Evil is just an illusion. I don't know how that can be explained. That I can't even wrap my mind around that idea. But that is the belief. So, what do you do to solve the Epicurean paradox here? You try to figure out why one of them is not so. Well, there's another way to do that, of course, and that is to understand that the way that unbelievers set this up for us needs a little bit of explaining first. If you let them dominate the situation, conversation, set things up according to their definitions, it's hard to answer. But the truth is, there's more to it than this. You see, God is all powerful, right? Well, what is it that God cannot do? He cannot lie. God is completely holy, so can he be unholy? No. God cannot, because he is omnipotent, do things that are counter to his character, the nature of God. He can't do things that are in opposition to his other attributes, like lying or coming unholy or not keeping promises, whatever it might be. He's true to his nature. So his nature limits what he will do because he's true to his nature as the holy God. So when they say, well, is he all powerful? They line it up so that there's no way to answer that question correctly. But what we know is that he's going to be powerful and do everything that is according to his nature, and he's going to be doing it good. Now, secondly, God is all good. So, if there's any evil in the world, God is not all good, right? No, that's not correct either. Because goodness does not always mean the absence of suffering, does it? What was the greatest suffering that's ever taken place in this universe? Christ on the cross. Was that good or bad? That was the goodness of God come to mankind to save us all. Suffering does not equal evil. And Jesus represents that to us as the ultimate example. Other things are suggested to us, and we can have a whole lesson on some of the things that suffering teaches us. But for instance, suffering may keep us closer to God. Because as we struggle in life sometimes, where do we turn? We turn to God. When everything's going okay, where do we turn? We turn inward. That's our tendency. When we are suffering, it could serve as a wake-up call, couldn't it? And we understood as we talked about Job that evil doesn't always come as a result of sin, and blessings don't always come as a result of not sinning. Okay, but sometimes is suffering still a wake-up call for us if we're in a situation we shouldn't be in? And suffering says you need change. You need to get out of that right now. Maybe it's a spiritual situation. Maybe it's a physical situation. You know, suffering. I suffer with pains in my chest. I'm going to go to the doctor and check that out. Pain is our friend sometimes, and that can be physical or spiritual. Suffering is not always bad. That's what they're saying. Suffering is always bad. If there's any evil in the world, then God is not all good. That's not so, Dennis. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then he's pointing out the existence of hell and the idea of that eternal punishment, the justice of God. But remember, there is the justice of God. That's part of his character too. God will not be untrue to his character. Does suffering make us homesick sometimes? You know, what if we just lived on this earth and we never faced any kind of problems? You know, the body didn't deteriorate. Would any of us ever go to heaven? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe we say, well, it's pretty good here. I don't want to die. But as we go through things in this life, young or old, we suffer things. We say, man, I'm homesick for heaven. Looking forward to being there. So suffering serves a purpose. So this is the response to the so-called paradox here. God is all powerful. There's some things he will not do because his nature does not allow that. God is all good. And the fact that people suffer sometimes is not something that impugns the nature of God's goodness. We'll look at that a little bit more at the very end. And right here in the middle of this chart, which I found, I did not draw myself because it already looks so good, free will for humans. God has designed what has to be the best possible world for us to live in. If he chooses to give us free will, and he did. He's given us the best possible world. We live in an orderly world ruled by the forces of nature that he's created and that he's helped us to understand. We have the choice to choose. Choose ye this day whom you will serve. Choose blessings or choose cursings. It's up to you, God told the children of Israel. Adam and Eve, there's the one fruit. Don't touch it. That was a choice. You touch it or you don't touch it, but it's up to you. God did not create robots. He gave us this free will. And that brings together those three features right there. Because God is powerful. God is good. But because it's a world of free will, and because human sin always, since Adam and Eve always have, there's going to be evil, at least for that very reason. Now, yes, sir. Go ahead, Kendall. The question is, do I think it's possible for us to figure out tonight exactly how God operates? And I'd say that's a pretty good ending for the book of Job if we were ready to conclude class right now. No, we don't. I think that's the idea. Go ahead. Right. That's a dual lesson right there. One is Job learned, I'm not supposed to understand it all. See, that was Job's plea throughout. Never cursed God, never blamed God unjustly. He just kept saying, I want to know. If God could talk to me, he'd explain this to me. I'm capable of understanding. I know how he works. Then he found out he couldn't. And twice he told God, I'm going to hush now. You know, I understand. I understand. You don't say anymore. I understand it now that I don't understand. And then as Kendall says, his faithfulness throughout that. That's a lesson for us too. Because we can do all we want to here talking about why these things are not really a paradox to the Christian and don't prevent us from believing. But when we're done, we still come up with the same situation as Job. Why does everything happen? We don't know why everything happens. We know a few things. For instance, why do people suffer? Why do people suffer? Sometimes, and we know this quite well, it's their personal decisions, isn't it? When people do things that are bad for the body, when they engage in behavior that's dangerous and foolish, what's going to happen? The consequences of their personal decisions. And we could talk about that for a long time and have had examples of it, but we understand that. People bring many things on themselves in the way of suffering. Secondly, the decisions of others. Foolish behavior by other people. It may be somebody that's current with me right now. It may be somebody from generations before that's done something and the consequences are still coming down by way of culture or genetics or whatever. A lot of bad things happen sometimes because others make poor decisions and the consequences get passed on. Sometimes it's because of natural law. God has ordained natural law. He's given us a universe that we can really understand pretty well. We know the basics. We know about momentum. We know that a moving vehicle is not something that we step out in front of. We know what the consequences will be. We know that gravity is very real and God's not going to suspend that just because I'm a pretty good guy. And if we climb up on top of this building and we jump off, we know there's going to be consequences. That's why suffering happens, because we interfere or we try to face off with these natural laws sometimes. Sometimes we suffer for being a Christian, don't we? Exactly. And we were told, don't think it's strange. In fact, if you get by without any kind of suffering, I'm paraphrasing, you might want to wonder about yourself. Because if you live righteously, you will suffer persecution. So sometimes for being a Christian. And then finally, and here's the one that we don't like. Here's the one that Job was left with. Here's the one that we're left with sometimes today. We just don't know. And with this comes the answer, Job, and for us. I just don't know. So what am I going to do? I'm going to live faithfully before God. I'm not going to accuse him with my mouth. I'm not going to accuse him of doing something unjust. I'm just going to remain faithful to him. Because I understand, just as Job came to understand, that I'm not supposed to understand it all. I'm not supposed to know why everything happens. Remember, Job never does. We've got an idea of it because we've got the book in front of us. There's no indication that Job had this book at the end of his ordeal. So, number one, we don't understand. We're not equipped to understand because we're not God. And number two, we remain faithful anyway. We just don't know. And that's a theodicy that comes to us from the book of Job. Well, we got about 2 minutes. And, I got one more slide I want to show you. Here's a quote. I couldn't track it back down after I read it. I forgot to write down the source. I couldn't track it back down. It may have been written by several people, but the Bible is less concerned about the origins of evil and more concerned about our responses to evil. Is that not the case? Job never knew, as far as we know, about that conversation that took place between Satan and God. Oh, you protect him. Give him to me for 5 minutes. I'll take care of him. He'll curse you. Came back a second time. Let me lay my hands on him, and he'll curse you. Job never knew about that. He never knew about the origins of what happened to him. Even as we can read it today, the Bible is less concerned about the origins of evil, much more concerned about how we respond to evil. If we say, God's got it in his hands, then I'm going to remain faithful. As Job gave us a good example. Okay, that's the book of Job. Comments? You got 1 minute. Okay. Brother Howard says it's part of God's will, and it was accomplished by who? Wicked men, wasn't it? It was accomplished by evil people. But still, God's will was accomplished. Oh, you're talking about that. Okay. Yeah, you're talking about that one. Okay. I was thinking of Bethlehem, particularly. Okay, thanks for your attention and your input.